My wife and I went on our honeymoon to Saba, a small volcanic island in the Caribbean colonized by the Kingdom of the Netherlands. The island is surrounded on all sides by steep cliffs, which make it impossible for cruise ships to dock there. So blessedly, it's been spared the Disney-fied fate of nearby islands like St. Martin and St. Kitts. Saba is known for its strenuous hiking trails through thick jungles, its world-class scuba diving, and its unique infrastructure. Before the 1930s, the only way to access the island was by mooring a ship on a rocky beach of an unprotected bay, then ascending an 800-step footpath known only as the Ladder, with a grade scarcely more forgiving than the sheer cliffs themselves. During our visit, my wife and I stayed in Windward Side, a tiny village prone to storms and fog, nestled in the shadow of the island's highest peak. Due to Saba's geology and historic isolation, Windward Side's population level has remained relatively constant since the mid-19th century. Most of the people who live here are direct descendants of the English, Dutch, and African families who first settled here in the 1600s. Not long after our arrival, we befriended two of our neighbors, an older married couple. The husband was from one of the original settler families, the wife was an American immigrant from Queens. They were extremely eccentric, but excellent hosts, and the husband in particular attempted to shower us with food and liquor whenever we saw them. When we were preparing to leave the island, the wife gave me a present. These, which she called slave beads. The story behind them that she told me was that when slave ships passed through the region, enslaved people who died along the journey would be tossed overboard, and that the bead necklaces they wore would later wash up onto the shores of Saba and nearby islands. This, as it turns out, is only partially true. Primary source accounts do describe African captives aboard slave ships wearing such necklaces, but it's far more likely that these particular beads were furnace-wound on the island of Statia, just south of Saba, and used as de facto currency in the Dutch Antilles during the early modern era. When the Dutch entered the slave trade in West Africa, they discovered that glass beads were a highly valued commodity in the barter economy there, and the custom traveled across the Atlantic with the triangle trade. Throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, Dutch enslavers in the Caribbean distributed these beads to Africans as a reward for specialized labor. Though the beads were frequently bartered within the enslaved community and had cultural significance, they weren't legal tender, so you couldn't use them to, say, buy your own freedom. On Statia, the beads became a symbol of enslavement. And according to local tradition, on July 1st, 1863, the day slavery in the Dutch Antilles was finally abolished, freed men and women gathered on the cliffs of the island to toss their beads into the sea, thus explaining the unusually large collection of them on Statia's beaches and in its shallows. But regardless of the actual origin of these beads, the gift filled me with horror. On the morning of our departure from Saba, as the ferry to St. Martin bounced over 10-foot swells and a bellyful of spiced rum from the night before roiled inside me, I realized that the sea over which we were sailing was a cemetery. These waves were tombs. There was no memorial, no museum like you might find at Auschwitz-Birkenau, but millions died here just the same. They died of starvation and disease in the dank holds of ships en route to lands most of them didn't even know existed. They died with swords in their hands, resisting the worst forms of cruelty imaginable. And many, facing hell on earth and with no land in sight, leapt off the gunwales of their wooden prisons and chose instead the cold embrace of the sea, taking huge, deliberate gasps underwater before the white men could realize what was happening and drag them out. The salt water filling their lungs, weighing them down, they fell away from the sun and plunged into an endless, bottomless, monster-haunted abyss. The transatlantic slave trade was one of the worst atrocities of modern history, and the Atlantic Ocean repeatedly bore witness, over the course of centuries, to some of the most horrifying acts of human cruelty imaginable. Most of these stories have never been recorded. But recent scholarship by Manuel Barcia, a historian at the University of Leeds, has given us a terrifying glimpse into the true depths of depravity which characterized this infamous practice. And also Europeans could smoke tobacco and enjoy a little sugar in their tea. This is the story of the Portuguese schooner Arrogante, presented not to shock you or titillate you, but to make your blood boil. Hey folks, so I realize given the topic of this video, what I'm about to do might seem like asking somebody out on a date during a visit to the Holocaust Museum, but it is what it is. I gotta say, these videos are not possible without the generous support of viewers like you on my Patreon. I've been spending a ton of money on the channel recently for my upcoming docudrama, The Vampires of New Orleans. We hired a locations manager who's been finding us some truly terrifying places to shoot, a makeup artist who's been getting unreasonably excited about doing tests where blood pumps out of people's necks, and I've also been doing a lot of traveling, getting on-camera interviews, including with one or two familiar faces.
Part of the lost cause myth and the trauma inflicted on the South in the Civil War is part of the reason why the Southern Gothic exists at all, is that you literally grew up with, going to battlefields and stories of people being mutilated in battles and these big mansions that are now abandoned in the woods, it's just, the story writes itself. And so it makes perfect sense that you would take the vampire from Whitby Abbey, a ruined abbey, in England, or the crumbling castles of Eastern Europe, and put them in the crumbling plantations of Louisiana and Mississippi.
So I hope you'll consider joining us on my Patreon to keep this whole project alive and thriving. Other great ways to help the channel would be to give a one-time donation via PayPal, to buy merch or memorabilia from my online store, or to buy or rent The Sudbury Devil, my historical feature film. You can find links to all that stuff down in the description or over on my website, Atun-Shei.com. As early as the late 15th century, European sailors and colonizers used accusations of cannibalism to justify the conquest and enslavement of Africans and American Indians. Instances of cannibalism among colonized people, whether real or imagined, was an undeniable sign of their primitivity and moral degeneracy. Non-Europeans were, in the words of Hegel, too, quote, sensual to distinguish the all-important difference between human and non-human animals. Cannibalism was anarchistic and satanic. Treating humans, made in the image of God, no differently than one would other animals, made mockery of Christian ecological hierarchy and Homo sapiens' exalted place within it. By degrading human beings, particularly white human beings, below the threshold of the Eurocentric conception of animality, Africans and Native Americans sacrificed some of their own humanity. Cannibalism was yet another indication that non-Europeans were less than human, or not fully human. Colonizing them, therefore, was not simply a naked quest for power and wealth, but an altruistic mission to bring the light of civilization to the darkest corners of the globe. While most of these stories were overblown, the truth is that during the early modern era, cannibalism was practiced by cultures all across the Atlantic world. We hear of ritual human flesh eating among the Haudenosaunee of upstate New York, wartime cannibalism in what is today Nigeria and the Congo, and an extensive cottage industry of medical cannibalism in Western Europe, where ground-up human skulls and disinterred Egyptian mummies were packaged, sold, and consumed to cure certain diseases. As we've discussed on this channel before, if you're new here, this is far from my first video about meat. The European moral panic about African and indigenous cannibalism was a classic case of projection. What could be more cannibalistic than colonialism and chattel slavery? By far the most bloodthirsty cannibals in the early modern Atlantic world were the monarchs and merchant adventurers of Europe, chewing through entire continents to feed their rapacious appetites. There's a good reason one of the most potent metaphors in all of Marx's writing is that of the capitalist vampire, sucking the life and labor out of all the working people of the world. And as Barcia points out in his paper on the topic, people in West Africa made this connection too. In a fascinating and not at all surprising twist, fear of white cannibalism was widespread in Africa from the 16th to the 19th centuries. Think about the slave trade from their perspective. Weird, freaky foreigners show up on your coast, round up people like cattle, then shove them into huge cargo ships and take them away, never to be seen again. The idea that Europeans were taking these people away to be slaughtered and eaten wasn't exactly far-fetched. especially when we examine the infrastructure of transatlantic human trafficking at the time. During the 18th century French slave trade in Senegambia, captives bound for Louisiana were herded to trading posts near the coast, and kept in holding pens, similar to those used to contain cows and goats. Slavers would then collect captives from all these separate pens into a massive proto-industrial warehouse on the island of Gorée, just offshore from where Dakar stands today. Here, captives would be crammed into windowless cells and chained to the floor while they awaited ships bound for America. Other trade items, including more conventionally eaten animals like cows, were also held at Gorée. For a Wolof person watching these operations from the mainland, the French factory at Gorée must have looked, sounded, and smelled just like a meat market, and cows would have been shoved into departing merchant ships just as often as humans were. A recent study on the genetics of domesticated cows in the Americas revealed a significant amount of African admixture in their DNA. Many of the cows Americans eat today are descended from animals brought over from West Africa during the Triangle Trade. Europeans were the world's most successful animal farmers, and enslavers across nationality and culture viewed chattel slavery as an extension of animal husbandry. The European conception of Africans as just another farmed animal is the absolute bedrock of early modern anti-black racism. In the 1803 tract Practical Rules for the Management and Medical Treatment of Negro Slaves, one British planter in the Caribbean dismissed abolitionist arguments as a slippery slope to humans relinquishing their mastery over the animals they raised and killed for food. Freeing the slaves? What's next? Animal rights? There is a surprising wealth of evidence that many captives aboard slave ships expected to be killed and eaten at any moment. In 1789, one Igbo-born British freedman recalled in his memoirs how he was filled with, quote, horror and anguish whenever the crew of his slave ship started boiling water for food. In 1839, the cook of the famous slave ship Amistad taunted his captives by repeatedly drawing his knife across his throat, making chopping motions, then pointing to a barrel of salt beef, suggesting it contained the remains of the previous voyage's captives. But despite all of this, recorded instances of actual white cannibalism were rare. Rare, but not unheard of. The British Empire banned the transatlantic slave trade in 1807, and in 1808 the Royal Navy created the West African Squadron, a fleet of ships which patrolled the Atlantic to intercept and arrest human traffickers. Slave traders, overwhelmingly Portuguese at this time, were driven underground, and the lack of oversight and regulation gave rise to new heights of cruelty and abuse. In Barcia's words, what happened on the slave ship stayed on the slave ship, and in the dreadful isolation of an ocean crossing, slavers could indulge their most sadistic impulses with few repercussions, or none at all. Which brings us to the schooner Arrogante. In October 1839, the Arrogante and her 35-man crew took on a cargo of 470 African captives from the Lomboko slave factory at the mouth of the Galinas River in Sierra Leone. Though the area was technically part of a British colony, Lomboko was, for all intents and purposes, the private fiefdom of Pedro Blanco, a notoriously brutal slave trader and something of an early modern mobster. The crew shoved their hundreds of captives into Arrogante's tiny hold, and together with 8 white passengers and a pig, set sail for Cuba. It's hard to imagine just how squalid and bleak conditions in the hold were for those 470 people. Suffocating heat, no air, not a lot of water, no medical attention, no designated place to go to the bathroom. Arrogante had an unusually high number of children and adolescents, and the really little kids died the fastest. The brig was full of dead children and their wailing, grieving parents. At one point, the crew actually tore a dead infant from the arms of its mother and tossed it to the sharks. On average, 5 to 8 people died every night aboard Arrogante. Barcia talks about primary source documents with page after page full of accounts of savage beatings. Rape was common. A teenage girl named Sam later described how at night the crew would take, quote, some of the girls up on deck for their wives. When one sailor tried to rape a woman named Cafasano and she resisted, he beat her so badly that he cut open her eyeball and her forehead. After some weeks of this, let that sink in, weeks, a handful of children chained near the galley, close to the upper deck, witnessed Portuguese sailors drag an adult man named Mina from the hold. They forced liquor down his throat, then took him behind a sail near the bow to keep the other Africans from seeing what they were about to do to him. Sadea, Mina's teenage half-sister, was among those chained near the galley. She later described hearing Mina shout, "Sadea, they are killing me," before screaming in agony. Manu, another teenage girl chained next to them, peered through holes in the sail to see the sailors cut Mina's throat with a long knife. A huge pool of blood then spread across the deck. A young woman chained below described how it drip, drip, dripped with languorous slowness down into the hold. Over the next few days, the slavers presented the Africans with strips of foul-smelling, blood-red meat served over rice. Those who refused to eat it were beaten with ship's ropes, often to death. The dish was, quote, flavored like horse meat, and some cuts were bristling with hair. I've got to wonder that if any point in the stinking darkness of the hold, as someone forced themselves to chew and swallow, they heard snorts and oinks from up above, and realized with unbidden terror that the ship's pig was still alive. Meanwhile, the youngsters near the galley allegedly witnessed Portuguese sailors boil and eat Mina's heart and liver. We have no idea what compelled them to do this. This was a routine crossing of the Middle Passage. The Arrogante was not running out of food. It seems to me that they ate this man for the same reason they perpetrated all the other atrocities of this voyage. Because they could. Because it is the inevitable outcome of an industry that reduces individuals to objects. Because, as Melville tells us, within the soul of man there is one insular Tahiti full of peace and joy, but surrounded by an appalling ocean teeming with the horrors of the half-known life. Off the coast of Cuba, and just days away from their final destination, the crew of Arrogante spotted a large warship on the horizon. The captain immediately gave orders to change course, but it was too late. The cruiser, a British brig sloop called HMS Snake, had already spotted Arrogante and began to give chase over choppy seas and through heavy rain. The Snake was the faster vessel, and after firing several warning shots at Arrogante, forced her to heave to. Led by their captain, Alexander Milne, the men of the Snake boarded the slave ship and were horrified by what they found. Milne later wrote that there were dead children strewn all across the deck of the Arrogante, and that the Africans who'd survived the voyage, only 330 of the original 470, were, quote, skeletons with death in their countenances, who begged the British sailors for food and water, pointing emphatically to their mouths. Enforcing the British Empire's prohibition of the slave trade, Captain Milne placed the Portuguese under arrest and took Arrogante as a prize. He assigned Lieutenant Robert Miller to guide the slave ship to Montego Bay, Jamaica, where these vicious and heartless men would face justice. So, a horrible story, but a happy ending, right? Nope. During the 11-day journey to Jamaica, Lieutenant Miller befriended Arrogante's captain and generally gave the slavers the run of the ship. The nightly rapes continued under his watch. Though Snake's surgeon was there to tend to the Africans' health, 74 of them died on the way to Jamaica, at an exponentially higher mortality rate than on the 40-day Atlantic crossing. And once disembarked in Jamaica, the children and adolescents of the Arrogante started telling anyone who would listen about the atrocities they had endured, particularly the forced cannibalism. Virtually no one with any military or legal authority believed them. It was only through the efforts of 2 determined British magistrates that an inquiry into the matter was made at all, several months later. British justices of the peace subsequently only interviewed 24 of the surviving Africans. Though differing in some minor details, their testimonies overwhelmingly agreed on the basic sequence of events. The Portuguese had slaughtered, butchered, and ate the man known as Mina. The inquest failed to follow proper procedure at just about every conceivable step in the process. The judges, who had a history of racist and biased rulings, placed undue weight in the testimony of the criminally negligent Lieutenant Miller, who bloviated at length about how Arrogante's captain was such a fine fellow, what a good chap. He'd never be capable of all that riff-raff. It must simply be all flim-flam, and fairy stories, and hokum. Eventually, the case was dismissed due to a supposed lack of evidence. Per imperial law, the Arrogante Africans were forced into apprenticeships in Jamaica. After all they had been through, they weren't even allowed to return home. So much for British abolitionism. As Portuguese subjects outside of the jurisdiction of the British Crown, Arrogante's captain and crew were released from custody. And according to a blog written by a researcher at the University of Warwick, Arrogante herself was sold, renamed the Iberia, and used again as a slave ship. She made another transatlantic crossing in 1840, with 330 captives in the hold. After depositing her human cargo in Puerto Rico, she ran aground and was wrecked on the coast of Cuba. For me, the tale of the Arrogante and the travesty of colonizer justice that followed are powerful indications that the atrocities of history, past, present, and unfortunately, probably future, can be so abjectly horrifying that it quite literally boggles the imagination. If the Arrogante was a horror film, we would say it beggars belief. No devil or witch from the pages of Shelley, Stoker, or Stephen King could ever hope to be as bloodthirsty as the slaver or the merchant adventurer. From 1517 to 1867, about 12.5 million people endured the horrors of the slave ship. If you're a Black or Hispanic American, it's highly likely that some of them were your direct ancestors. Nearly 2 million died at sea along the way. 2 million. 2 million skeletons lie at rest on the sunless seafloor of the Atlantic, crushed under the weight of miles and miles of water. I'm hesitant to offer any hope at all here. I generally agree with Terry Gilliam's famous critique of Schindler's List and its triumphant third act, that such endings are delusionally comforting and offer easy answers where there truly are none. But something that I think is crucial to understand about this history is that the enslaved were not hapless victims. Slave trading in Africa was dangerous work. The historical record is full of instances where captives got access to weapons and successfully defended themselves from subjugation. Revolts were common in slave factories like Lomboko and Goree. They weren't always successful, but they all did economic damage and made it harder for slave traders to operate. In her book on slavery in colonial Louisiana, Gwendolyn Hall argues that African resistance in the slave factories, at sea, and in America via conspiracies with indigenous tribes during the Natchez Uprising created so many problems for the Company of the Indies that it effectively halted the slave trade to French Louisiana. And in July 1839, off the coast of Cuba, captives taken from Lomboko and Sierra Leone, many of whom may have been from the same communities as the Arrogante Africans, sawed through their chains with a rusty shard of metal, armed themselves with cane knives, and slew their oppressors aboard the slave ship La Amistad. However, ultimately, the legacy of the slave trade is a gaping open wound that has barely even begun to start healing. This was an industry so barbaric that accusations of cannibalism scarcely attracted notice. Slavers had good reason not to make a record of their most outrageous crimes. And if this is what we're getting from mere glimpses into the world of the slave ship, who knows what might be treacherously hidden just beneath the surface. Of those horrors, only the merciless, masterless ocean can tell.